Well, hello again, beloved students. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your host for this Reform Era video trilogy, and I'm the host of our ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. Well, you know the drill. Focus, take great notes, master the material. Let's get right to it, shall we? When we last left our heroes, we had discussed a number of the religious utopian communities, but I left you with a cliffhanging question. Were there any non-religious utopian societies during this time period? The answer, yes. There are three that are worth mentioning, but you'll forgive me for not going into excruciating detail about each of them, as their impact was small and limited. First, there was Brook Farm, a community made up of northern intellectuals who liked the idea of going to live on a big farm together where they could think deep thoughts about romanticism and transcendentalism. Unfortunately, putting philosophers in charge of running a farm isn't really a recipe for stability and success, and it died out pretty quickly. So too did the Fourierite settlements. These were planned communities based upon the philosophies of Charles Fourier, who believed that the way to make a functional community was to put them into what he called cooperative phalanxes, in which people got paid based upon how unpleasant the job was. People who dug ditches and cleaned latrines would be paid the most, while people with easy jobs, like bookkeeping, would be paid less. Not surprisingly, this didn't work, and people left the Fourierite community. And then there were the Owenites, followers of the socialist philosopher Robert Owen, who believed that the ideal communities should be socialist, atheistic, free love communities. And that appealed to some people, but his ideas never really caught on in America, at least not for very long. And so we can look at all three of these utopian communities and say that they failed. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our study of utopian groups, those people who wanted to separate from society and create their own ideal communities. But what about those who were more realistic, who hoped to reform and redeem society from within? What about them? Well, they're up next. To review, religious reformers, especially those growing out of the northern wave of the Second Great Awakening, believed that it wasn't enough just to convert souls. They needed to put their faith into practice because faith without works is dead. And that meant they needed to take active steps to make earth as it is in heaven by removing sinful practices like slavery and alcoholism from society. And that meant caring for people at the bottom of society too, by the logic that, in Jesus' words, what you have done to the least of these ye have done to me. And perhaps this explains why reformers spent so much time promoting charity, designing programs that might lift up the so-called less fortunates. And surely this included promoting temperance, extending rights for women, and most importantly, eradicating the great sin of slavery. The first group of less fortunates are those afflicted with deafness. In previous centuries, a physical malady like this might be seen as a curse from God, and a deaf person might have been ostracized or cut out of society. But reformers focused on the humanity and the dignity of deaf people and devised ways to help them compensate for their physical impairment. The leader of this movement was Thomas Gallaudet, who encouraged the incorporation of a sign language system to help people who couldn't hear still participate in society. Now, this often did require the development of special separate schools, specially designed to help deaf people learn to survive and thrive in a hearing world. Eventually, Gallaudet gave his name to what became the most famous college for the deaf, and that was established in Washington, D.C., Gallaudet University. The second most famous is the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. Can you guess in which city in western New York it's located? I bet you can. Like deafness, blindness was a physical affliction that societies for centuries had attributed to being cursed or otherwise less than. But with the new spirit of reform, leaders like Samuel Gridley Howe pictured here, believed that we should reach out and help make accommodations so that blind people could function fully, or at least as much as possible in society. Of course, this meant developing a written language that could be felt instead of viewed. This was the Boston line type system, a precursor to the Braille system that is widely used today. And this also meant that there needed to be separate schools for the blind to make sure that they got everything they needed. The most famous of these schools was the Perkins School for the Blind, but over time, schools like this started popping up all over the country. While physical afflictions were relatively easy to diagnose, mental illness was much more difficult. If a person's behavior was abnormal, well, other people in the society might just think that they had been cursed or possessed by an evil spirit. Some people describe this as being touched by the devil. Or they might just not know how to address that behavior until the mentally ill person violated some law or social code and got thrown in prison, where of course there was no hope for treatment or improvement. Enter Dorothea Dix, who encouraged people to see mental illness not as a curse, but for what it is, an illness. And this meant that people with mental afflictions needed to be sent to special hospitals and treated with care and compassion. One of the biggest mental health facilities to emerge from this was in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it was called, fittingly, Dorothea Dix Hospital. Well, physical and mental maladies were things that people had no control over, but what about those individuals who had violated the social code and ended up in prison? Didn't they deserve what they had coming? Well, probably, but reformers would insist that even after being convicted of a crime and physically separated from the rest of society, prisoners did not lose their humanity. Indeed, it meant that they were now part of the less fortunates. They maintained that if you treat a prisoner like an animal for 20 years, beating him and denying him his basic humanity, at the end of those 20 years, you'll have produced an animal incapable of functioning in the real world. Instead, reformers said that we should treat these people like people. Don't treat them like animals. Try to rehabilitate them so that when their term ends, they'll be capable of living and functioning in the outside world, making recidivism, or falling back into a life of crime, less likely. This more humane system earned the nickname the Auburn system, named not for the college in Alabama, but for the town in, you guessed it, Western New York, where this new method was first tried. And let me take a moment to remind you that words matter. Instead of calling these facilities jails or prisons, both of which emphasize punishment and negative consequences, facilities like that in Auburn were called penitentiaries, as in places where a person could be penitent, that is, to show remorse and work to redeem their souls. And that's key, because if you want to focus on redeeming souls of prisoners, it means that you still believe that prisoners have souls worth redeeming. And that is how you show humanity to the least of these. Well, earlier we mentioned temperance as one of the goals of religious reformers. Now let's give it the attention it's due. As we learned from the circumstances surrounding the Boston Massacre, alcohol consumption lowers inhibitions and leads to unintended consequences. It also deprives families of the money they need to survive, and the strong, sober parents that children need. Consider this cartoon, in which a husband worked in the public sphere, but instead of coming right home, he stopped off in the saloon and drank away his day's wages. When he returned home to the family, penniless, the wife asked where he had been. And because the husband's inhibitions had been lowered by drunkenness, he responded in a violent outburst. As the cartoon says, he, in a state of furious drunkenness, kills the wife with the instrument of their misery. That meaning the liquor bottle. And So what is the result in this scene? Well, the mother is dead, the father is headed to jail, and the children are headed to the orphanage. See, that's why a person should never take that first step up of alcohol, because we know where that inevitably leads, up the drunkard's progress and right back down again. So you might ask, if we do reject alcohol and if we do stay sober, then what are the benefits? What is the opposite of the drunkard's progress? Well, it is this: the fruits of temperance. You see the father, well-to-do, and returning from what is surely a management position at the factory in the background. His wife is there at the doorstep, still in the private sphere, and I'm going to use aggressive air quotes to say where she belongs according to social values. The kids are happy to see their father. There's a dog in the yard, a nice house. The message is clear: alcohol ruins families. Temperance saves them. But perhaps the biggest social evil of them all was slavery, and reformers took dead aim at this peculiar institution with a renewed sense of religious zeal. Because how could a society claim to be rooted in equality when millions of people were held in permanent bondage with no rights, no protections, and no hope for a better life? Obviously, it couldn't, which is something that Frederick Douglass pointed out in his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" As you can see, the abolitionist movement didn't just have one leader, but many, each playing a pivotal role, a unique role, either writing or speaking out, agitating for the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all enslaved people. David Walker's incendiary writings inspired slave rebellions, and it might not have been a coincidence that Nat Turner's rebellion took place just a couple of years after his work was published. Well, one person you might not have met yet was Elijah Lovejoy, who published an anti-slavery newspaper in Illinois just across the Mississippi River from the slave state of Missouri. One day in 1837, a pro-slavery mob crossed the river, attacked the newspaper office, murdered Lovejoy, and, for good measure, threw his printing press into the Mississippi River. The murder shocked the nation, and it bears remembering because it involved white people killing other white people over the issue of slavery, for maybe the first time, but certainly not for the last time. And if you've perused your big old packet of Reform Era fun, you've seen the longer excerpts from these noteworthy figures. Now, hopefully, you can see how they fit into the larger narrative of the Reform Era. If you can't see that yet, go back and read those texts again. You won't regret it. Now, the most famous abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison, and we mentioned him early in this slideshow because he is significant, but he's significant not just because he kind of looks like a turtle here, but because he began publishing his virulently anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator back in 1831. In the first issue, he declared war on slavery, demanded its immediate end, and stated, "I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And indeed, he was. Consider this: Garrison published his newspaper each and every week for 34 years, never missing a single week. Indeed, he didn't stop publishing until December 1865, and only then because that was the month when the 13th Amendment was passed, which outlawed slavery. Talk about a sustained commitment to a cause. Garrison was the real deal. And lest we think that Sojourner Truth was the only female abolitionist, we should certainly mention the Grimke sisters. Their perspective was a unique one. As wealthy Southern women, they had seen slavery up close, and so they knew all about the horrors of the institution. The Grimkes argued for abolition in their Appeal to the Christian Women of the South. saying that slavery not only destroyed the lives of enslaved people, of course, but it also ruined the souls of the white slaveholding families because it allowed a culture of abuse, cruelty, sexual assault, and indolence among the wealthy enslavers. Therefore, Christian women of the South needed to agitate for the abolition of slavery, primarily so that they could save the souls of their husbands and sons. Another famous abolitionist was Lucretia Mott, who felt so strongly about the issue that she set sail for England in 1840 so that she could address the World Anti-Slavery Society Convention. Unfortunately for her, when she got there, she was initially denied entry and eventually allowed to attend only so long as she didn't speak. And that is a remarkable moment in which a powerful voice in the anti-slavery movement was silenced because of gender bias. Well, not surprisingly, Lucretia Mott came to see that the fight for abolition and the fight for women's rights were actually part of the same civil rights struggle. And she came home and started working for the cause of women's suffrage. Which brings us to the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. And I'm sure you're wondering why it didn't take place in Rochester. Well, Seneca Falls is another mill town on the Erie Canal, just a short trek from Rochester, and it happened to be the hometown of one of the convention's organizers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The convention attracted lots of folks who came to see that women could not be effectively advocates for civil rights so long as they could be shut up or ignored or denied their own civil rights. In addition to Stanton, Lucretia Mott and Frederick Douglass both participated in the two-day convention. And at its conclusion, the convention issued the Declaration of Sentiments, along with a list of resolutions and proclamations. It was based on the text of the Declaration of Independence. That group then made this important correction to Jefferson's document, proclaiming that all men and women were created equal, endowed by their Creator with the same inalienable rights. And if you remember the Declaration of Independence, you'll recall that long list of complaints about the king, starting with the word he. Well, here, the convention organizers kept the same pronoun, but instead of listing the king's many failings, the group listed the ways in which men and male-dominated institutions of government conspired to keep women silent and powerless. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, the direct object of the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, meaning the right to vote, and as a result, women were forced to submit to laws in the formation of which she has had no voice. The message here was clear. Women deserved social and legal equality. Would they get it? Well, keep reading your textbook to find out. Before we leave the subject of women's rights, we need to mention one very special lady, Margaret Fuller. Often considered the first feminist writer, Fuller was a scholar and an activist, arguing for full and immediate legal, social, and economic equality for all women. In her classic book, Women in the 19th Century, she made her case. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to women as freely as to men. If you ask me what offices they may fill, I reply, any. I do not care what case you put. Let them be sea captains, if you will. I also love the fact that she knew how smart she was. I now know all the people worth knowing in America, and I find no intellect comparable to my own. Well, sadly, Margaret Fuller was killed in a shipwreck in 1850, which probably wouldn't have happened if they'd actually let her become a sea captain. Okay, so now it's time for us to switch gears and talk about Romanticism, that European philosophical movement that emerged in response to and as a challenge to the ideas of the Enlightenment. But first, I want to introduce you to this man, Alexis de Tocqueville. There are some people who you can use to really impress AP essay readers by cleverly dropping a reference or a quotation into an LEQ or DBQ response. Tocqueville is one such person. He is absolute AP gold. So, who is he? Well, as the name suggests, he was from France, but he was fascinated by the United States. In the early 1830s, he decided to come here and find out for himself precisely what made America, America. He traveled all over the country, from plantations to factory, rural areas to Washington, D.C. And what did he discover in his journeys? Well, Tocqueville determined that the thing that made the U.S. unique was, wait for it, the lack of an aristocratic class. Because it meant that Americans, and here we're talking about free white men, without the benefits or without the limitations of an aristocratic class, those people could go wherever they wanted, start a farm, start a business, climb up or fall down the economic ladder based upon skill and effort. And the result was that dynamic society that I was talking about back when I was introducing the roots of American reform. And here's a quotation that I think pretty much sums up his view of America. Born often under another sky, meaning migration or immigration, placed in the middle of an always moving scene, a dynamic, ever-changing society. Himself driven by the irresistible torrent which draws all about him, the American has no time to tie himself to anything, like European customs or rigid class systems. He grows accustomed only to change and ends by regarding it as the natural state of man. Unlike timid, class-conscious Europeans, the American feels the need of it more. He loves it for the instability of this dynamic, constantly changing culture, instead of meaning disaster to him, seems to give birth only to miracles all about him. That is great stuff. And as you move through the course, look for Alexis de Tocqueville quotations and the opportunities to use them. You'll be glad you did. We have covered religion and reform, and so there's only one topic left to cover: intellectualism. And here I'm talking about philosophical movements and the way that the ideas and concepts of these movements found expression in the art and literature of the age. And so we've arrived at the next great intellectual movement, Romanticism. Now, please don't confuse this with romance, or Romans for that matter. Romanticism was a philosophical movement that started in Europe as a reaction to the Enlightenment. If I can vastly oversimplify the issue, we can say that Enlightenment principles embraced reason and rationality and felt that touchy-feely things like emotions and feelings and hunches and intuitions were less important and should be suppressed in favor of reason. So in the battle between the head and the heart, the head being the center of logic and reason, the heart being the center of feelings and emotions, the Enlightenment thinker thought that the head should always dominate the heart. And while this made sense, over time it left people cold, and it left people wondering, why should we even have emotions if they're always supposed to be suppressed? Enter Romanticism, which argued that the head, reason, and heart, emotion, were both natural, human ways of being, and that they should be given equal weight. And so, sometimes romantics are viewed as being overly sensitive and emotional, but it's just in contrast to the robotic stoicism of Enlightenment thinkers. Or, to put it another way, you could probably appreciate the gentle interplay between the colors of this screen in my presentation. But what happens when I introduce bright purple and yellow colors? Well, if you're a ECU or LSU fan, you might start cheering, emotion. If you're not, you might wince at how bright and painful the colors are, especially right next to each other. Those emotional reactions you're having, that's totally natural. So don't suppress them. Express them. Well, Romanticism is a big amorphous term, subject to misinterpretation. So for our purposes, let's focus on the three main overarching ideas. First, naturalism and individualism. By naturalism, we mean both an appreciation for the natural world and an embrace of those natural attributes of people, meaning the balance of head and heart as being equally valuable. But it also celebrates the role of the individual, acting naturally in a state of nature that is freed from the constraints of societal expectations and demands. This idea of the individual in a state of nature will make more sense to you when you're deep in the woods on the junior mountain trip. And as we just learned from Alexa de Tocqueville, change is totally natural. Children grow from infants to toddlers to young people to adolescents to adults. It's a progression that is sometimes awkward but totally natural. So too do the seasons change, and we should embrace that change. As tide comes in and goes out twice every day, naturally, as the moon goes through its phases, naturally, and the more we study history, the more progress we make. So the Romantic would say, let's celebrate that too, because it's natural and wonderful. And all of the above might make us react with natural emotions. Maybe happy, sad, anxious, excited. But each emotion is natural and helps to shape our character and identity. Suppressing emotion, as Enlightenment thinkers would have had us do, is to deny half of our being, half of what makes us, us. So, with these three ideas in hand, let's see how they manifested themselves in American works of art. And in speaking of art, we need to talk about the Hudson River School. First things first. We often call artistic movements schools, but please don't confuse these with actual institutions of higher learning. You can't attend the Hudson River School, so take it off your list of potential colleges. What is noteworthy about the Hudson River School is that it is the first honest-to-goodness American school of art. And look at how it celebrates the natural world in all of its glory and grandeur. Often you'll see a human figure or two, but look how small and insignificant they are in contrast to the environment around them. You might look at a painting like this and think, looks like hotel art to me. And that's understandable, but remember, you have probably seen a lot more of this country and the world than most of the people who would be looking at this painting in a museum or art gallery. To them, an image like this might be overwhelming and awe-inspiring, as indeed it should be. Now, there are plenty of great Hudson River School artists, but the two most important ones, and the ones I want you to know about, are Frederick Edwin Church and Thomas Cole. Let's take a look at some paintings from each of them. The first, by Church, is one of my very favorites. He called this Twilight in the Wilderness, and you can see both the grandeur of nature and the emotions that it provokes. The thing about sunsets is that they're fleeting, liminal things. Today, you might see the sky turn pink as the sun begins to set and think, oh, that's nice. And then 10 minutes later, it's completely dark. But there's often one magic moment sometime in between when the sky looks like it's just on fire, and the only acceptable reaction is complete awe. Well, that is the moment the church has captured here. It's spectacular, fleeting, out on the edge of civilization, at the very edge between day and night. And see how it incorporates all the aspects of Romanticism, the embrace of the natural, the moment of change that provokes a strong emotional response. That, my friends, is Romantic art. Well, Church is also famous for painting an awe-inspiring image of something a lot closer to home, at least closer to our home. Out in western Virginia, between Lynchburg and Lexington, is a place called Natural Bridge, and it features a huge, wait for it, natural bridge. And if you've never seen it, take a look at Church's painting of it. It's pretty impressive, right? Here again, you see tiny human figures dwarfed by the grandeur of nature out at the edge of civilization. And if you ever go to see this place, and I hope you will, please be sure to look for the place where 18-year-old surveyor George Washington carved his initials into the bridge wall. G.W. Founding Father, Vandalizer. The next artist you should know is Thomas Cole. One of his most famous paintings was this one, called The Oxbow, and it depicts a lot of the same themes we've come to expect from Hudson River School art. An awe-inspiring scene of the natural world just at the edge of civilization. And speaking of edges, you can see that the storm clouds are rolling in. And you can imagine that 5 minutes after this moment being depicted here, the whole scene would be clouded over and drenched in rain. But for this one moment, we can feel the change that's just about to come. Another great Thomas Cole painting is this one, and it depicts another natural scene out on the frontier. You can see a horse, a house, a rider, a tree stump, and clearly this is a mountain holler at the edge of civilization. Change is all around, first because it's autumn and the leaves are turning, but also because we see another storm cloud in the corner, ready to roll in. These are just a couple examples of the Hudson River School art, but I hope you can see how the artist embraced the ideals of Romanticism, naturalism, individualism, change, progress, and emotionalism, and made great, uniquely American art. And it wasn't just painters who flourished during the Romantic period. American writers embraced the same ideals and created some of the finest pieces of literature in the century. As I list them, you'll note that they're all white men. And this is not to suggest that these were the only people creating great art, because there weren't. But we do have to acknowledge that these folks were far more likely to have access to people in the publishing industry. Even the great Emily Dickinson, who wrote during this time period, only had about 10 of her poems ever published in her lifetime. One can only imagine how many even better novels might have been written by women or people of color had they enjoyed the same privilege that these men did. But let's start with James Fenimore Cooper, who's most famous for his novel The Last of the Mohicans, which depicts the interactions between colonizers and indigenous people at the edge of civilization around the time of the 7 Years' War. Another naturalist is Herman Melville, whose Moby Dick tells the agonizingly long tale of a whaling boat, just a dot of civilization amid the vast sea of the natural world, and what happens when one man tries to conquer nature by killing the whale. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. My poster child for change and progress is Nathaniel Hawthorne, which seems strange because he set most of his stories in colonial times. But in doing so, he's helping readers to see both how American society has changed and progressed, and the ways it stayed the same in the 200 years since the beginning of colonization. Perhaps you've already learned about this if you've read The Scarlet Letter, and if you haven't read it yet, do it. Do it now. Now, for emotionalism, I'll point you in the direction of Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman. Poe is an obvious choice because his stories and poems are so spine-tinglingly creepy that it's almost impossible not to have an emotional reaction to them. And Walt Whitman's writings are less eerie, but they are sensual and evocative and groundbreaking and frustrating and delightful. You're supposed to react emotionally to these works, and doing so is why they are such great examples of Romanticism. One last topic before we close the book on Reform Era: Transcendentalism. If much of Romantic thought was just imported from Europe, well, Transcendentalism represents a truly and uniquely American aspect of the philosophical movement. Why did it flourish here in the United States and not Europe? Well, maybe it's all the change and migration and social mobility of American society, people pushing past perceived limitations and expectations to create something wholly new. Transcendentalism embraced all of that, and the key is in its name. Trans meaning across, send meaning to move, therefore to move across. This philosophical movement was all about pushing the envelope and moving across artificial, socially constructed barriers. So what were some of the main ideas? Well, Again, I'm oversimplifying here, but here goes. First, it's the romantic belief that reason and intellect alone are not sufficient. Feelings and intuitiveness are equally important to living a meaningful life. Transcendentalists also believed that at their heart, people were basically fundamentally naturally good, just like John Locke had said. They had limitless potential, but too often people are confined by human institutions, like factories and clocks and etiquette, so that they never reach their full potential. The goal then should be to release people from these arbitrary limitations and then let them thrive in a state of nature. Essentially, put down your notebook, stop watching a video presentation, and go live in your own state of nature, unrestricted by the confines of some teacher telling you what to do. And of course, I'm a teacher telling you what to do, so you should probably move past that perception as well. Transcendentalists also embraced personal spirituality and the individual's experience with the divine, but they believed that human institutions, like organized religions, well, they placed arbitrary limitations on human capabilities, and so they should be rejected. And lastly, the ideal person is the one who stretches beyond their known capabilities. And this doesn't mean developing superpowers. It just means constantly pushing to learn and develop and improve and expand and explore. And if all this sounds fun, but not especially realistic, let's remember that this is a philosophical movement created by idealists and dreamers, not a recipe or a battle plan. Perhaps the best image to describe transcendentalism is this one, the tidal pool. If you've never seen one of these, it's because they're fleeting things. They're a tiny ecosystem that gets created every time the tide comes in. As the tide recedes, water is trapped in the pool, and organisms are born and live and have their being and die in a couple of hours before the tide rushes back in and washes everything away, and the process starts all over again. So is the tidal pool on land or is it in the ocean? Is it neither? Is it both? Right. It's on the ever-changing edge. And this happens if you go to the beach too. Some parts are always dry, some parts are always wet, but the sandy area where the high tide covers is both land and sea. And if you talk to an environmental studies expert, they will tell you that this is something called a liminal zone. That is an ever-moving edge between land and sea. And you know what thrives in liminal zones? Starfish. Oh, okay, technically they're called sea stars, but these fascinating creatures effortlessly navigate these liminal zones. So if you want to be a great transcendentalist, and of course you do, channel your inner sea star. And that means you need to embrace liminality. Liminality, the edge between and moving across that edge. Liminality, it's great. You will be glad you did. Now, many Northern intellectuals joined the Transcendental Club, but the two most significant philosophers were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. I invite you to peruse the big packet of Reform Era Fun to see some of Emerson's quotations, to see how he put those ideals of transcendentalism into practice. Thoreau is an interesting case because he operated at the edge of society, once even retreating to a cabin in the woods to experiment with living in a state of nature, and another time refusing to pay his taxes because he believed that the money was being spent to spread slavery during the Mexican War. Interesting gentlemen. But they, of course, weren't the only ones, and you've met some of them before. These were people whose life stories pushed past perceived limitations, like Margaret Fuller, who stretched the definition of women's capabilities, or Emily Dickinson, who managed to get a few of her luminous poems published in a male-dominated industry, or Walt Whitman, whose writing pushed the very boundaries between prose and poetry, and of course, Frederick Douglass, whose entire life seemed to be an exercise in exceeding expectations and pushing boundaries. There are, of course, more writers, more painters, and there's always more to say about this era. But at long last, we have reached the end of this video presentation. I hope you hung in there, paid close attention, and took excellent notes. And I hope you learned something about this time period as well. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the other side of the screen.